We are not far away from global population peaking. There's still this sense that we are at unending growth and we're all going to perish from overpopulation, but that's really not the case.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today, how do we plan for our global future? Decades away, what will our world look like? Most we can't predict. I, for one, still waiting for my flying car. But at least one thing is certain. We are at the beginning of a fundamental shift in modern human history. The global population is still increasing, but the growth rate slowing a lot. By the end of the century, we'll start to see depopulation, and the people on Earth, on average, will be a lot older. So what do we do about it? Is a slow-moving crisis inevitable, or can we adapt? My guest today, Jennifer Sciubba, President and CEO of the Population Reference Bureau, says our demography is our destiny, but how we prepare for it is up to us. What does all this mean for immigration, women's rights, and the future of global power? We'll get into all of it. But first, the world is quietly being reshaped by a ticking demographic time bomb.
Japan's fertility rate has hit an historic low.
The U.S. population is older than it's ever been.
Italy's national birth rate has fallen to its lowest level on record.
Experts are warning that global fertility rates will drop below the point needed to sustain the world's population.
2/3 of the world's population lives in countries with fertility rates below replacement levels of 2.1 children per woman. By 2050, 1 in 6 people on the planet will be 65 years or older. While the global population is still increasing, driven by growth in developing countries like Nigeria, Pakistan, and Somalia, experts predict the global population will peak within 60 years. The economic and social implications of that are huge. Smaller populations means fewer workers, more retirees, declining tax revenues, and slowing economies. So governments all over the world are doing what they can to try to boost birth rates, especially in East Asia, where the population crisis is severe. In Japan, the demographic decline is so bad the imperial family is literally running out of heirs. Japan has the oldest population in the world, so the government has expanded parental leave. They've subsidized daycare, and they've introduced cash allowances to get people to have babies. For decades, China limited births to 1 child per family. Now, communist officials knock on doors to ask women about plans to have more kids. President Xi Jinping has called childbirth a national priority and a patriotic duty. In South Korea, sales of dog strollers have outpaced actual baby carriages. The country has the world's lowest birth rate, which the government has declared a national crisis.
저는 오늘 인구 국가 비상사태를 선언하고 저출생 문제를 극복하는 그날까지 범국가적 총력 대응 체계를 가동할 것입니다.
Korea has tried it all: cash incentives, tax breaks for new parents, housing benefits, even matchmaking services. Nothing is working. The problem runs deeper than economics or policy. Modern society is changing. People are delaying marriage. They're prioritizing their careers. And for women, more education and opportunity most often means fewer children. Immigration could help. 1.2 billion people will age into the labor force in developing countries over the next decade, and there aren't enough jobs in their home countries to support them. But in many places, accepting large numbers of immigrants is politically toxic, and even countries with growing populations are going to peak within the next few decades. So maybe it's time to embrace reality. We can't turn the demographic clock back to the 1950s. Instead of pushing for more births, governments could also rethink old age, invest in lifelong learning and new technologies to keep people productive for longer, extend their working lives, redesign retirement and Social Security to support older, engaged populations. The aging crisis could be an opportunity to create a blueprint for how societies thrive with the populations they actually have. The future won't look like the past, and that's not such a bad thing. Here to help us unpack population trends, how governments are responding, and what the future might look like is one of the world's leading experts on demographic trends, Dr. Jennifer Sciubba, President and CEO of the Population Reference Bureau. And here's our conversation. Jennifer Sciubba, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
And we have not had a big conversation about demographics on the show, and it's about time, right?
It's certainly time.
It's something we can actually project.
We can.
We can talk about the future with a reasonable degree of certainty. What's the single thing that you are most confident of that you suspect our audience doesn't know?
I don't think most people realize that we are not far away from global population peaking, and that most of the world is far down that path already. I think there's still this sense that we are at unending growth, and that the globe is just filling with people with no end in sight, and we're all going to perish from overpopulation. But that's really not the case.
Now, I've noticed that, I mean, there's this massive trend that, women, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, the most sharp increase is zero children. And we're seeing that all over the world, really, right?
Yeah.
What's driving it?
Well, we have to break it down into two different buckets here. So if we think about places in the world that go from very high numbers of children per woman to lower, and we'll just throw out a number for us of replacement levels about 2, obviously, replacing both parents. So that's a number to keep in mind. When we say from this high level to that replacement level or just under it, typically speaking, ending child marriages, so people get married later, obviously that shrinks the number of years in which you might be having children. Increasing education, including secondary level education, and having rights-based access to family planning and health services. That brings it down. Work in there, how all these feed in together with opportunities for work outside the home. So there's a greater opportunity cost for having those extra numbers of children.
And that's what's now happening in India, happening in Africa.
And has been happening for a long time. And so I think people have a general sense of that. The puzzle that we've been sitting with today, though, is there's not a bottom. Like, where is the bottom for the average number of children per woman? And so the question that I think most people are wanting to know is, why does it keep going lower? And for that, it's a much more complicated answer, because you can't just say, well, we are continuing to educate women, so they're not having children. In fact, we're starting to see data that the more educated women, so now when we say educated, we're not talking about women who get out of high school. We're talking about women with advanced graduate degrees. They're actually seeing rises in the number of births. So we can't just say, oh, the relationship between education and fertility rates is straightforward. It's better for us to break it down.
What is it that worries you the most? Because I hear when you're talking about population contraction, I hear a level of concern in your voice. And I'm wondering what drives it.
There are two things that concern me. One is when we paint population as the problem, we look for population-based solutions. And we see murmurings around the world, I would say particularly in the United States, if we want more babies, then we might have to make that happen. So when you see population as the problem and population as the solution, I really worry that women's rights, access to contraception, for example, are on the chopping block. The second thing that worries me is that we've kept the focus just on the population numbers. So how many babies will there be? Why are there so few babies? And we've taken no responsibility for adjusting to this. So I think we are decades behind in preparing for the world that is surely to come. And instead, we keep trying to think only in terms of this as a population issue.
Now, but I wanted to get a little past that and say, let's imagine, we had this massive, run up from just a couple billion to what's going to be 10 over just a few generations. Why is it necessarily so horrible if we have a gradual slide from 10 to 8 to 7 to 5? Why is that necessarily a problem?
For me, it's not necessarily a problem. For governments, for families, it could be a problem. So the governments that do not adjust their systems, they will have a problem. And in fact, if we're thinking geopolitically, who's likely to come out on top, it'll be the ones who realize the fastest that they're not going to reverse these population trends, and they instead build to deal with it. That means you're thinking about things like the workforce, your use of AI, for example, education, housing, social security systems. And I think that it's also an issue at the family level, though, because we have very poor care infrastructure around the world. And so if the government is not the one who is taking the responsibility for caring for the people, and it's not that case, not the case everywhere in the world. We tend to think about European-style social welfare systems and aging, but not every country in the world has that system. For example, look at Singapore. So who holds the bag then? It's the family. And when we say the family, that's really code for women. So failure to prepare and put in place systems that deal with what you actually have, which is an aging, smaller population in the future, well, that's what's really dangerous.
What happens to a Japan, a South Korea in a generation if they don't actually pivot to a changing population?
Japan's probably adjusting better than many other countries. I think about France, for example. Let's just contrast Japan and France. We can see that Japan average age of exit from the workforce is at older ages. So people tend to work longer. The population is healthier. That right there gets you huge bonus points when it comes to adjusting to aging. In France, they've got a healthy population, but there's still all these pressures for early retirement. Well, when you're living decades beyond retirement, you really constrain those social welfare systems. So, that's what I look for. If you are a country that the government has made extreme promises to take care of you, and there are fewer people in the workforce, then there's not as much money flowing into that pie, and those pies being divided in many other ways. So I think the strains in government budget is where we'll really see the biggest issue. So there are trade-offs. Yeah. I mean, what will go while you pay for an older population? Will it be defense? Will it be something else? Will it be education?
Especially an older population that has a significant amount of power over political decision-making.
That's where I think the democracy part is very interesting. I love democracy, fantastic, but I think it's very difficult to do long-term planning in a democracy, and demography is the ultimate long-term planning. It is looking out and saying, in 30 years, we know what the strains will be. How do we put in place structures now that support that? But instead, voters and politicians, they have such a shorter-term view, so I really worry about the ability of democracies to kind of pivot and prepare for the future that's just 20 to 30 years ahead.
Now, the other side of the policy equation is if you don't like what's happening with your population, can you change it? Right? I mean, China's gone from a one-child policy to a two-child policy to a three-child policy. Isn't changing their demographics at all.
No.
What have we seen in place that has made a significant difference in changing population trends?
Well, if we think about population trends as three pieces, there's the births, and there's the deaths, and there's the migration. The migration piece, countries can do a pretty good job of changing. In fact, we talk about porous borders, but really, at the end of the day, they're not that porous, especially if you define borders as your asylum systems, all the adjudication. States have pretty good control over their migration part of things. The death part, countries also have some control over, little asterisks here. We're going to talk about the United States because there's a lot that countries can do to invest in health and longevity. And so our aging problem, so to speak, is partly because we're living longer, and that's a great thing. The United States, compared to its peers, however, what we think of as our peers is not in the same boat. So the U.S. peers in terms of healthy life expectancy or health span are Russia, China, and Mexico. It's not Southern Europe. And so we are at a significant disadvantage there.
So we've talked about death, we've talked about migration, we haven't talked about
the big one.
The big one.
Yeah.
Having kids.
Having kids.
And that's the one that I suspect you're going to tell me you can't move very much with policy.
You can't move very much, which of course China is finding out because, they can say, please have babies, please get married. There's so many countries out there that are actually in the business of trying to do matchmaking. Korea is also one of these countries. And it's very difficult to get people to get married and have children because the government wants them to here in this modern world. The approach that most governments are taking, particularly in Asia, to the low fertility issue. They are really focusing on gender, but in the wrong ways. Because this actually is an issue about gender. It's an issue about women's opportunities, women's rights. We just don't tend to frame it that way when we're talking about it at this geopolitical level. But at the end of the day, reproductive decisions, they're made either between couples or perhaps even individually for women. And so when we have these national level policies, they really often do not resonate at the individual or household level. And so most of these countries are trying to lean into how do we convince women to have more kids, or how do we create a system to get them to have more kids? And these opportunities look all over the place. So China is actually doubling down on traditional roles. They're calling for women to exit the workforce and get back into the home and have babies. Women who've been exposed to the idea that there's a bigger world out there, they're educated, they've perhaps, moved to the cities already, they have jobs, that does not resonate with them. And so they are really pushing back against that. In South Korea, they've had a lot of the same kind of rhetoric and policies over the years. So there's a huge feminist movement in South Korea that is actually having women opt out altogether of even dating.
What are the governments right now that are doing the most to try, however ineffectually, to change their birth rates?
Korea is one of the countries that is doing the most. They have spent hundreds of billions of dollars trying to raise fertility, and they are doubling down. I was there not that long ago, and they have set up a new population ministry to really lean into this more. And there's a sense I get that some of these messages around gender are resonating. For example, it's not just putting in place a paternity policy, saying, okay, we want there to be paternity leave, and that'll solve everything. They have that in South Korea, but fewer than 10% of dads take it. So then that points to another question. Well, it's not just the government policy. Okay, so now then is this really a population issue or is it an issue with workplace culture generally?
Now, one of the things that interests me a lot about demographics is we have such a wide variety of countries out there on the basis of what their populations look like. I mean, you have African countries out there where the average age is 18. Right. And on the other hand, in Japan and South Korea, it's like over 50 now. What have we learned? What do we know about how countries are different on the basis of their demographic profiles?
When we think about the base population, that determines, of course, what the priorities are at the country level. So when your base is so radically different, it gives you completely different priorities at the country level. So if you are in a very young country, you are extremely worried about how you're going to educate your population. Maybe 40% of your population is younger than age 15. That's your set of issues. You're worried about creating jobs for people so that they will have opportunities as they get into those working ages. If you are on the other end of the spectrum, you're thinking more about, do you have enough workers to especially support those entitlement systems that you very likely have put into place? So really different sets. We're worried about empty cities in Japan, and you're worried about building enough housing in Lagos. So just it's wildly different, and it makes me worry about what we do at the global level when we have all these transnational issues we need to come together on, and we've got over 30 shrinking countries, and we've got a set of countries whose populations will double over the next 30 years.
Yeah, you have people starving all over the world, and then you have massive amounts of waste of food, and you have ghost cities in Japan and in China too, and yet you've got huge housing crises in other places. So much of this feels like a distribution challenge.
A lot of people will just say, well, why don't we send those people from those young countries who need jobs to the places that are old countries where they need workers? But that's where I always say, immigration is much more of a political issue than a demographic issue. So when we want to talk about it within demography, we tend to talk about it like an economist would, like they're not real people. No offense to my economist friends, but they just think about, we could just let's send people where it looks like they should go. But politically, of course, that's not how it works. And we also know that immigration brings with it its own host of challenges and changes, and not all countries we should expect will go down that path.
So when we see populations that are much younger, populations much older, are there any connections with type of governance? I mean, we know what the priorities have to be, and they're very different. What about democracies and authoritarian regimes?
Well, at the very young level, yes, we know a lot. I mean, young countries, meaning countries that the average person is very young and they tend to have higher fertility rates, they are much more likely to be incredibly unstable, experience coups, and not to be democratic. And so where we're trying to figure out from a research perspective is if there's any causality there, meaning we used to think, I would say, Arab Spring time. Around the Arab Spring time, we had a lot of questions about whether or not an older age structure would lead a country to become more democratic. I don't really think there's a lot of support for that now. I think instead we understand what we've known to be true for a long time, which is a demographically youthful country. It's not transitioning to democracy. If it does transition, it's not going to stay that way. And so, of course, when we're thinking about the world of the future, the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, there's a set of countries, including Nigeria, that is not likely to see movements in that regard.
And these are going to be Nigeria, one, Indonesia and other, Pakistan. These are some countries that are going to be some of the world's largest.
That's right.
That we don't spend a lot of time thinking about right now.
Yeah, we don't. And, the question, I guess, would be, to what degree do our global power structures, the global influence, does that line up with population size? We were doing this conversation 100, 150 years ago. We would be so certain that those two things would align. Now, of course, that's not the case. And so how fragile are our global systems that they could break down those structures of post-World War II? I tend to think they're pretty well entrenched. And so we'll actually see power being concentrated in the hands of smaller and smaller countries, even as the rest of the world grows.
Jennifer Sciubba, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Ian.
That's our show this week. Come back next week. And if you like what you've seen, or even if you don't, because you don't remember it, getting old, why don't you take a minute to sign up for our excellent morning newsletter, fittingly called GZERO Daily.